So hello, good morning, and welcome everyone to the session 5 of our lecture series, Architecture of Territory, in, in the fall semester of 2020. And we are delighted to be able to welcome our second guest this season, Antoine Vialle. And Antoine's identity will remain a little bit obscure for the next 5 minutes or 6 minutes while you work on your exercise. But before we start, let us please, if you want, put on your cameras just to give everybody the impression and a small or kind of a the amount of eye contact that we can afford in this Zoom interface to see each other's faces. So thank you so much for being here. Welcome. I see some people are with masks. Maybe this is not entirely necessary. Wonderful. Thank you for being here. So we are the auditorium is still filling up. I see at the moment 138 people, a wonderful audience, and we are eager to engage in this session. So we can now share the screen. Metaxia has prepared the terms in the honor of our guest, Antoine Vialle. And the terms on the table today are.
So, good morning. And although we don't reveal yet the full identity of Antoine, you might get to know him a bit through the 2 words that he gave for you. So, the first word is land. So, if your name starts from A to M, please take a blue pen and the word land. And the second word is soil. So the rest of you from N to Z, you take a red pen and the word soil. And as always, we invite you to use a sketch, words, and your imagination to discuss on this A4 piece of paper, these words. We give you 5 minutes starting from now. And at the end of these 5 minutes, we ask you to upload the drawings on our WhatsApp group and discuss them together with Antoine. So time starts from now. Okay, so here we are. Antoine, you're also invited to comment on the drawings that we will be going through.
Let me look at them a little bit before.
I will now be projecting them one by one.
Yeah, okay.
So starting with this one, land.
We have, we first had a perspective, then we had a kind of a notion of a bounded territory actually, and this is more kind of a pattern of land use.
Agriculture use and some soil.
Okay, here is a soil.
Oh, land as a percentage.
And what does he say? 29%, and I didn't get it.
Shrinking.
Shrinking. Okay. I wonder what it refers to.
I guess agriculture.
Ah, very nice.
Artwork.
Land, in the
It's divisions.
It's the plots, right? The land, like privatizing, I guess, or a lot. Ah, nice.
From house plants borrowed some soil.
Those two are quite.
This is nice, you know, this
Yeah.
kind of rhizomatic picture.
It's the part which we don't see.
Exactly, yes.
I'm sorry. Here.
It can serve as a metaphor for the other one, as for many kind of, let's say, rhizomatic systems or structures that are reflected in each other and that have a more visible and less visible part. I recommend the art book by artist musician called David Byrne called Arboretum. You will find a lot of such drawings. What are you seeing, Antoine?
I'm seeing fascinating things. I'm amazed by the fact that I was guessing that students would. Do you hear me? Yeah. Would know more about soils than expect, but it's clearly the fact. So it's really interesting to see how the knowledge on soils is actually spreading very quickly now.
Mm-hmm. Land is for a lot of people also about property, and I think that's interesting to discuss.
Absolutely.
I wonder if it has to do with the German word land, which, if I'm not mistaken, also means country, right? So my and so land
I
is.
think it's true that in different European languages,
But
land
also,
and territory have different meanings.
Nazli, you wanted to say?
Come back to the one before.
This one?
The one before.
sorry, my connection is going sometimes.
Okay, amazing. These are words I will use.
Great, very good anticipation by Sandra.
Layering, pressure, time, cycles.
And granularity. Granularity is probably one of the most fascinating. Okay.
Soils are, maybe we could say, kind of a skin of the earth.
Yeah, this is on this one you see an animal. It's super important. Earthworms are, and this animal.
And thank you for indicating that it's a wrong color. We can probably digitally turn it to red eventually. Here is also another little mole, and very nice to see that, Sophia. Thank you. The worm, great. Land, a more poetic vision of land with a kind of lines of perhaps topographic or other kind of layers or flows. Nice.
Here a piece of infrastructure. I think it's a sewer to a canalized river.
That's also very, very important. Yes, we are here now in the territory of urban soils. Nice. Land, a couple of times we've had this island with a flag.
Yes.
You know, I mean, I love these interactions via Zoom because I'm sure that students are not probably, you know, copying each other's drawings, right? Because in auditorium, it's easier to just look at you know, across the, let's say you can see very easily what everybody is doing, and this creates a kind of resonances. But this is fascinating. We can be very, very clear about the kind of common, let's say, symbolic structures behind those notions.
Here it's the island, but also with a geological dimension, let's say.
It's
cut out piece.
Yeah.
Again, this plot.
This is a very, very, I would say limited. There was one that looked like a kind of a fenced playground. I would say better to call that a playground or not land, but land in terms of a property for sale. Yes, I understand. That's one of the meanings indeed.
I think it's quite interesting because, I don't know, it maybe goes back to the whole discussion of, I don't know, nomadic population. At the moment that you settle, you become a farmer and you really relate to the land. So it seems that it opens, let's say, a bigger window. So maybe we see a few more and then we can conclude. Antoine, would you like to have a final word on the sketches?
Yeah, I will. Let's look at them. It's I'm really keen on this exercise actually.
Great. You will have one more actually later, so that will be very entertaining.
Maybe we can conclude on this: the area of the unbuilt, agrarian land, unused land, forest land, land of the Anthropocene, built land, the invisible land, area of the speculation.
That's it.
collection of meanings, and also kind of actually a nice layered perspective which captures many different meanings.
Thank you.
And very, very thoughtful work. Thank you very much. That was Olga. Thank you very much, everyone, for this nice warm-up today. And let us now introduce Antoine.
So Antoine, thanks a lot for being here with us today. Antoine is our second guest in this lecture series. And I have to say that, as Milica mentioned earlier, he's actually a friend, a person we know since quite a while, and we have collaborated with him in various occasions. So Antoine Vialle, he's an architect and a former fellow of the French Academy in Rome, Villa Medici. He has been since quite a while teaching and lecturing in various schools, and he's currently developing his PhD dissertation, almost concluding at the moment, on the topic of soils of the Swiss city territory. He's doing his dissertation at the EPFL Laboratory of Urbanism with Professor Paola Vigano and Erin Verrecchia as supervisors. And in 2019, he has been a doctoral visiting student at the MIT Leventhal Center for Advanced Urbanism in Cambridge. So Antoine, welcome from our side, and we're really looking forward to follow your lecture. I would suggest to the students to switch off their cameras at the moment so that we have a better...
They did already.
Already, I don't see them. And I would also like to suggest to choose from the view, the standard view, not the gallery, so that they have a full screen with the slides of Antoine. So thanks a lot, and the speech is yours.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Professor Topalovic, for this invitation. It's really a sincere pleasure for me to share this this ongoing research on urban soils that is actually coming to its conclusion in these days, in these weeks. So it's for me a very thrilling and intense moment of reflection, of synthetic reflection on this topic. So maybe I will start full screen also. Okay, so this research is entitled West Lausanne Urbanization as Anthropogenesis, a section through the times and spaces of urban soils. The topic of this research is actually the transformation of the soil by urbanization. So it implies that urban soils need to be documented or acknowledged, explained, and criticized somehow as a project in time, both in a retrospective or historical way and prospective or future-oriented way. It also implies that these urban soils needs to be documented at different scales, from very large scale of the map to the very close scale of the soil profile, and even closer to its material dimension. So as I told you, I'm now in the process of concluding all this reflection, and it's a very intense moment. I would like to share with you at least three main ideas. The first one would be what's a soil? I'm quite, as I was saying before, I was amazed by the knowledge you and your generation probably already has on soils. It was probably very different even 10 years ago. I was in particular surprised that you already associate the soil with some very technical representation, sometimes very precise. But still, what is soil and why is it important is something I would like to discuss with you today. The other idea is how looking at soils provide
Sorry, somebody need to mute their microphones. Okay.
So the second idea is how does looking at soils provide an alternative vision and a different understanding of the contemporary city we live in. And probably the last point, which is important for me today to share with you, is somehow as architects or planners or landscape architects, actually what will be your interaction with soils in the future, and how can you probably contribute into this soil question that is rising now. Okay, so I will then show you a few images of that have been produced by soil scientists, pedologists, to describe and explain what's a soil. So in French in particular, the word sol has multiple meanings. It's very polysemic. In France, it ranges from the floor, so in the architectural building, to the land, which can be associated to the territory. So very different scales, very different time scale. But in these two words, floor or land, soil is basically associated to a surface. Basically the surface we live on. Actually, soil is also, as defined by soil scientists, a volume, okay, that you can see on this section, for example, on the left of this slide. But it's not only earth, it's not only a substrate, it's not only a material. Soil is actually a living system. Living means there are organisms in it, it's inhabited. Living also means that soil is in constant evolution. Soil is a volume that is somehow few centimeters or decimeters to 1 or 2 meters thick in our regions. It can be more, it can has a greater depth in some other regions, and in particular in the tropical regions. But in our region, it's about 1 meter, maybe 1.5 meters. It's a volume that is situated at the articulation of the lithosphere, so the rocks, which can be soft, but rocks, mineral sphere, the geology, and underneath and above the atmosphere. Okay, and it's living because it's produced and it's changing by the action of living organisms such as animals, little animals, or fungi, bacteria, and plants. The action of organism and the action of climate, rain and sun, that slowly decompose and recompose the lithic material that is underneath the soils to create this very particular layer, which is the soil. It is important because as a dynamic system, soil provides different functions, such as absorbing water, providing nutrients to the plants to grow, storing water that will evaporate. And these functions are actually essential for human beings to survive on the earth, and especially also now in face of climate change, global warming, and all these new evolution. So yeah, soil provide different functions that are equated in the language of environmentalists as ecosystem services, which are divided into different categories. The providing services, so through soils, we get access to building material, construction material, we get access to food, as we grow plants in soils, and animals also grow on soils, usually. And provisioning services, they also provide regulating services. So for example, they absorb some stormwater, they capture carbon and sink the carbon that is also in the atmosphere as greenhouse effect gas, and they also provide what is called cultural services. They are somehow the archive of the environmental and human history, and they are important and vulnerable because now with urban growth dynamics, we consume a huge amount of soil to develop the city in particular, to mine, and to develop intensive agriculture. So soils are now being degraded at a very unprecedented rapidity somehow. So this is a very general definition of soils as a living and dynamic system. To understand this a little bit better, I will share with you an experiment, a live experiment, very small thing that I did during this the course of this research in the last 2 years, actually. And this small experiment will help me to give you a basic understanding, but more practical of this system. And it will also be related to the small exercise that I will suggest you to do at the end of this lecture. So pay attention to this soil I will present you. So this small live experiment was made on the occasion of festival of ephemeral garden in Lausanne. So it's a festival that happens every 4 years, I think, and a series of different ephemeral gardens are installed in the city. And you can make a kind of promenade from one to another. And last year, the topic of this festival was soil, open soil in the city. What's the earth, the open soil, and the city? So I was like, wow, that's my topic. Let's do the competition. Hopefully, with a bunch of friends, we call each other non-site office. We won this competition, and we won on a site that is the Parc de Valency in Lausanne, which is a beautiful park in Lausanne. And we proposed to do a little intervention that maybe can be called a land art intervention. We actually created a small pass, a steg, in this park, and by doing so, we kind of cut a little bit the soil to let. To make the invisible thickness of the soil to reveal it somehow. So that's aerial view of the project. Why did we do this pass? Well, the one way to explain it is the fact that I don't know if you see my little hand on the screen. I was living here, and so this park was kind of my private garden when I was living here during my studies. And it's a beautiful park. As you can see, it's mostly made by very large meadows. That is somehow, I would say, an idealized version of the Swiss landscape. So a very soft, large meadow that is gently going down to the lake. And it's surrounded by a series of passes, alleys, that are somehow around this lawn, but one part of this network of alleys is missing in this zone, which is very annoying because I was living here. I was often trying to go there, and I had to go all along the park to go, and this alley was missing because it was actually, I went to look in archives, and at the beginning of the project, it was intended to make a path in this area, but it was not possible because there is, as you can see with the trees here, an esplanade in this park, which is at the center of the park. And to create this very flat esplanade, the landscape designers had to slowly rise the topography and create an earth fill in this zone. So the topography was too steep to establish the Steg. So we decided to do it by cutting into the topography. As I told you, on the occasion of this project, I dug in the archives of Lausanne Municipal Archives, where I found a multitude of treasures regarding this park and its history, multiple letters from different stakeholders of this park and what it was before. So I found letters of the landlord. I found letters from some farmers who were exploiting this place before it became a public park, etc. And I found this letter from someone in the Municipal Council of Lausanne who is answering to a journalist at the time of the creation of the park in the 1940s. The journalist is complaining because the construction work of the park are delayed. And this guy from the Lausanne municipality answer him this sentence I put in red. Faut-il répéter que les terres, on en a tellement remué à Lausanne, se font assez rares. So the construction work is delayed because they are missing some land, some earth. And he explains that at this time, so the first part of the 20th century, there was so many land moved, steered in Lausanne that the earth is missing. To give you an insight of what he means, this is some images of the transformation of the Flon River in Lausanne, which is at the center of the city. It's a kind of an equivalent of the Zil in Zurich. And as you can see, the Flon River is being, during the first half of the 20th century, half filled in completely by a huge thickness of earth material. These houses are going to be completely recovered by earth. And you see this earth comes from these various construction works. It also comes from all the domestic wastes that are added to this dump site. So you can see when we speak about earth transformation in Lausanne, it can come to gigantic proportions. So yes, the idea of this project was somehow to kind of document this history of this soil you can see in here by creating this path and accompanying this project with some sections. Okay, so this is an image of the park when it was just implemented in the 1940s. And I asked some soil scientists to give a name to this soil that was created with this park. So this is a soil that has now somehow 80 years ago. And soil scientists gave me this name, calcaric terric cambisol escalic lomic. So main name is cambisol, which is the name that you can find also. If you walk in the forest around Zurich, you will find a lot of cambisol. It's a soil that is quite recent. Cambi means that it has an horizon that is appearing and structuring more precisely. There is a color change from a dark brown on the top, which means there is a lot of organic matter, to lighter color in the depths. Calcaric means it has a lot of calcareous material in it, which can come both from the mountains or from the construction waste that would be mixed up with the earth. Terric means that there is a layer that has been brought up by man, Also, escalic, you know, like lavo terraces, refers to the fact that the earth was leveled, and loamic speak about refers to the texture of the soil. Okay, so that's the soil, how it was 80 years ago. We did this pass. It was a nice occasion for the public to see and observe from a close scale soil. Then the public go away, and as I told you, this project was ephemeral. So we had to put back the soil as it was before. It was really on the contract, because this park is now classified as a monument somehow, and also because this meadow is now exploited by a farmer who got subsidies, and these subsidies, agricultural subsidies, are based on the quality of the soil. So we had to rebuild the soil as it was before. So when we took the soil off, we were careful to stock the different layers of the soil in different places, and then also to put it back using the lightest caterpillar we can find, okay? So that's what we did. Then the meadow came back and start to take care of the soil, recover the soil again. And that was a few months ago, this summer, in June probably. So I went back to the soil scientist and asked him, so what was the name of this soil again? And suddenly, surprisingly, the name of the soil has changed. It's not anymore a combi soil, it's a regosol now. It's still calcaric, it's still loamic, but it's a regosol. So it's a different soil. Regosol alludes to regolith, which is the lithic material, very fresh, that can be moved by a river, for example, or by a landslide. So it's really basic lithic material, and at the very beginning of it, when it's not structured with, as a soil with different horizon, etc., it can be called a regosol. Okay, so it's a baby soil somehow, a soil that has only few months of life, and you can see it's a very different soils because of these poppies that are here. These poppies are these red flowers only grow on fresh soil that has just been turned somehow. So you can find them usually in the countryside at the ecotone between, for example, a field and a road, or a field and a rail track. And here, they only grew up in this part of the soil that is modified and that has been turned. Okay? A little live experiment, which has actually great, important consequences, because every document written by a soil scientist now regarding man's influence on soil starts with the same sentence, which is actually a very shared consensus in the scientific community, that soils is not a renewable resource. So that's really the consensus, but wait, if soil is not a renewable resource, how comes the city of Lausanne was able to produce a combi soil within 80 years, and I was able to produce a regosol in 1 year? It's in contradiction with this idea of soil as a non-renewable resource. Actually, this idea is true in almost every cases. Soil is something that takes thousands to million years to appear in its natural, very refined dimension. But in very few cases, man is able to produce some kind of soils, basic ones, regosol, combi soil, fast enough so that we can consider that soil is renewable within a historical time frame. And where does this this happen? Not really in the natural environment, not really either in the agriculture milieu. Usually it happens in reclaimed mining sites or in cities. Okay, so when we speak about urban soils, all the different kinds of soils we can find in city, this notion of non-renewable resource has to be discussed precisely. Actually, I would like to very briefly introduce you to the work of this soil scientist, Dan Yalon, which inspired a lot of my research because he wrote two texts, one in the 60s, if I remember well, and one 10 years ago somehow. And these two texts are saying the same thing, these things that soil actually transform the soil, sorry, that humans transform the soils. But he says it in two very different ways, in the 60s and now. In the 60s, he speaks about the fact that he says that human can create new soils. With all this idea that somehow man is building up a society by transforming his soils. Okay, a few decades later, it somehow changed a little bit the way he phrased it, and he speaks in terms of a human natural body. So this idea that man, human, and soil somehow co-evolute. There is a co-evolution of man and soils, and actually there is a kind of blurring of the boundaries between the two things. So this guy was also a teacher who developed a methodology to study and understand man-made soils. I drive your attention on what is drawing in this blackboard. As you can see, it's a section, probably a section perpendicular to a river. So it's a kind of soil sequence that is organized with topography. We call it a topo sequence or a catena. It will be important for later. And so I try to re-understand this notion of anthropogenesis, the fact that human can generate soils, considering the contemporary soil system or the urban soil system as a system that superimpose and make coexist different soil system, the natural soil system that is generated by topography, lithology, biology, and time. The historic soil system that is really related to cultivation, and the contemporary soil system that is also influenced by mining, urbanization, etc. So somehow our soil system is a kind of palimpsest. This palimpsest, this notion of palimpsest, is also represented by a soil profile, which is actually a snapshot in time of all the environmental and human history. And it's interesting because this notion of palimpsest is also used very frequently by, let's say, urbanists to refer to the process of formation of the city as a palimpsest, with this notion that territory is the product of a sedimentation. It's interesting when we look at soils because actually it's not only sedimentation, it's not an accumulation of time, it's the whole material of the soil that is constantly reprocessed to become a future. And so I kind of synthesized this influence of human influence on soils with this notion of urban soil historical trajectories. Different history of soils that generate different kinds of soils. These are the soils I analyzed in my case study. So basically, there is three main influencers, three main factors that correspond to a series of maps I will show you later. The original landscape conditions, topography, lithology, biology, etc. That is influenced and transformed by what I called metapedogenesis. So recurrent main influence that can be associated with cultivation. It's not only cultivation, but cultivation is the most important influence. And a third influence that is punctual. Sometimes we move the soil. We do cut and fill, and we change the soil, we move it, we turn it, etc. And these three factors combine into different historical trajectory and generate different soils. So I try to map these different historical trajectories on my case study. I will introduce it better later. But you can see I tried to do a map on the left that correspond to what was the situation at the beginning of the 20th century, and a map of the situation now. On the left map, you see the dominating color is yellow, which correspond to the soils that are influenced by cultivation. Whereas on the right map, there is a lot of blue that correspond to this notion of what I call anthrosediments or urban sediment. The idea that by building the city, we move the soil and we displace it, etc. So 1/3 of the territory, maybe it corresponds to this 29% we saw in one of the students' drawing. 1/3 of the territory in West Lausanne is covered by anthrosedimentation, so man-made soils. Okay. So let me, in the second part of my presentation, I will try to explain a little bit how this soil system was generated, commenting the three maps that correspond to the three factors I show you on the diagram, and also relating it to some example of soils I studied more in depth. So three maps. First one corresponds to the landscape, the native landscape, the geomorphology, that is the kind of bed on which the city is implemented. The second one corresponds to cultivation practices and land use changes. And the third map corresponds to urbanization and anthrosediments. Okay. Before that, just a little introduction of this case study. So you recognize this is Switzerland. I'm not going to comment much, but as you see, you can see that Switzerland is crossed by what we call the Swiss plateau, this main inhabited part of Switzerland that is ranging at the north of the Alps. And this Swiss plateau actually corresponds to a sedimentary basin, molassic basin, that range basically from Chambéry in France to Vienna in Austria, 800 kilometers of this sedimentation basin. And actually, this Swiss plateau also corresponds to a very specific type of urbanization that you can see a little bit on this map. It's clearer on this one, which is a close-up. You see, tick, 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 all these villages equidistant that cover the Swiss plateau as a continuum. And among this very specific type of urbanization, you see Lausanne and Morges that create an agglomeration. And West Lausanne in red is at the middle in between Lausanne and Morges in here. Okay, this is West Lausanne in red, and on the background you have the soil map that has been produced by the cantonal authorities. And as you can see, this soil map has a white hole that corresponds to the city. This is a typical situation you can see in sorry, every soil map. Urban soils are never documented on soil map because until recently they were considered as non-soils. Okay, so somehow the purpose of my research is to fill in this gap. And so you can see this is what was before the map. It's the map of all the soil core that have been sampled to produce the map. I will show you also some soil samples I have done and in order to fill in this gap. So I selected this map extent that corresponds to West Lausanne and tried to map it. I tried to map it based on the informations I have throughout the time, and it's interesting to note that the evolution of available data regarding soils also correspond to an evolution in the consideration, cultural and technical consideration for soil over time. At the beginning of the 19th century, I found a set of maps, beautiful maps, that are made at the very close scale of municipality, in which the soil is very documented in details. All the land surface is represented with cultivation, trees, etc. Whereas this information tends to disappear in the topographic map that are produced over the course of the 19th and 20th century. And as you can see, then the surface of the land is represented in white. But we can find alternative source of information such as photography, and recently LiDAR point clouds that document very precisely the soil, and that gives an opportunity to recreate actually the information we lost since a few decades. Okay, these are the 6 soil samples I will also show you. Here they are, and they have been selected according to these trajectories I was describing before. Okay, so the first layer of the map, the first factor that I tried to map is geomorphology, which corresponds to both topography and lithic material, form and formations. Okay, so it's a volume and it's also a relief. What's the story? Very briefly, what's the story of this map? At the very beginning, you have in Lausanne, you had a sea, a very shallow sea. At this moment, the climate was very warm. There was palm trees and crocodiles. And this sea generated this sedimentation basin of the molasse, okay? All over the north of the Alps. Then the Alps rise, the climate changed totally. It was very cold at the time with huge glaciers. Lausanne was covered by the Rhône glacier, actually, which was hundreds of meters thick, and somehow sculpted this molassic basin. As you can see, the Rhône glacier is basically following the Lake Geneva, but just after Lausanne is here, there was a splint of the glacier that cut through the molassic basin and create this shape, actually. And so the topography of West Lausanne. And then the glacier turns into a lake that slowly rises down, leaving behind him sedimentation terrace. Then rivers, but they are not very important in Lausanne soils. It's more important in Zurich. And the last layer, the red color, corresponds to the human transformation of geomorphology. So this is the red color corresponds to Anthropocene, okay? And as you can see in Lausanne, there is huge transformation of geomorphology by humans, okay? Some sections just to give you a three-dimensional insight on these maps. So as you can see, this relief is the molasse, and the glacier kind of erase it, creating this kind of scales. Here you can see the glacier and the morainic reliefs. I like moraines. I will be speaking a lot about moraines today. And actually, so it's all the lithic material that is carried out by the glacier, and glacier is pushing it on its side and creating these moraines on its side. And then the glacier turns into a lake and leaves these terraces behind him, okay? The second layer, cultivation. So using the maps I was talking about before, I tried to reconstruct the vegetal cover of West Lausanne at the beginning of the 20th century and now. As you can see, at the beginning of the 20th century, there is a very clear project that is expressed by this mesh of equidistant villages that are surrounded by these belts of vineyards in yellow and pastures in dark green, on the background of the agricultural crops, which are mostly cereals in Lausanne, West Lausanne, sorry. And now, actually the two maps are very different, but they are made with the same symbology that comes from, let me comment this very quickly. These maps, the maps I was referring to, were devoid of legends. Only one had a legend that was actually, that helps me to interpret every maps. And this legend is really interesting since it's very simple, but it also reflects a very clear project. What is represented? Buildings, meadows or pastures, fields, woods, vineyards. Actually, at the time, vineyards was not only grapes. It was something that is now comparable to permaculture. So it was a mix of perennial crops. And finally, two things, gardens and squares. what's in France, place. Okay, I was struck by the ambiguity of these two terms, gardens and squares. First one refers to, I don't know what, ornamental gardens, but also vegetable gardens at the same time. And squares refers to at all the transportation surfaces, streets, etc. So I keep this, this symbology, this terminology, also to describe the territory of the contemporary territory. And as you can see, it's interesting to note that in West Lausanne, which is actually an urban territory, a third of the territory is dedicated, it's still dedicated to agriculture and woodland. A third of the territory is covered by this polysemic notion of garden. So all the open soils that are not in agriculture and that somehow accompany the buildings. And a third of the territory is sealed or built. Okay? And as you can see, I have only had information for the beginning of the 19th century and today. So somehow the first interpretation of these two maps is the destruction of agricultural landscape. If I compare the two maps and I look at for disappearance, it's almost all red. So I try to reconstruct the process a little bit beyond this notion of destruction of a territory, of a landscape, sorry, trying to reconstruct this the emergence of this strange notion of garden, okay, the non-agricultural open soils. So I try to delayer this layer into different historical series, and I obtained this map, which helps me to quantify, in terms of surface, the emergence of this ambiguous typology of land cover, the garden. Okay, the third layer is related to anthrosedimentation, so how urbanization moved the earth around it. So here I mapped a series of different urban structures in time. That was easier because in the topographic map, these elements are represented. And I also quantified their evolution in terms of surface. So this map is what we call a bivaricated map. So it has two variables, typology and times. And that's interesting because it helps to understand the very specific urban form of West Lausanne as a dynamic morphology, something that changes along the time. So it's more in terms of continuity than in terms of disruption, okay? So this is a delayering of this map in terms of typologies. You can see building, roads, railway, etc. But also, so maybe I should comment, the urbanization has an influence on soils because it buries the rivers, it reclaims land on the lake, cemeteries, landfills and dump sites, etc. So not only buildings and roads. But the second reading is if we take period by period, we can see the evolution of this urban figure from a mesh of equidistant villages to somehow a diffuse densification of this mesh into what is now the contemporary territory of West Lausanne, okay? And we can see, looking at these figures, that it's not a process of urban sprawl, but more a progressive densification of an urban mesh. Okay, I will try to comment a little bit these two, but very quickly because I think I'm a bit late. Yes, I'm terribly late. I will try to comment a little bit these two, this process. So this is what happened in the first half of the 20th century. And you can see at this moment, this territory is mostly rural, but somehow parcel by parcel, plot by plot, this territory is being developed into residential and industrial activities that are still embedded into the agriculture. And I give you one example of a soil in here. It's a garden, vegetable garden for the workers of the gas plant in Malais industrial zone in Lausanne. And so it's a vegetable garden embedded completely in the industrial zone. So when I investigated this soil, I was expecting a very impacted soil. On the contrary, this soil is quite in good condition. As you can see, there is a darkest layer that corresponds to the addition of organic matter to this soil in order to grow food and grow vegetables. But behind it, this soil is quite natural. It's a bit polluted, but it's quite natural. So that was a surprise. And it corresponds to the fact that at the time, if you had an open soil next to your building, it was intended to produce food. It was related to gardening activities. Okay, so you care for its functional dimension. This is the second half of the 20th century. You see that the urban figure is completely different. There is a change in scale in terms of urbanization. So this urbanization corresponds to major infrastructures such as highways and also housing complex, larger housing or industrial complex, with the emergence of a new urban tool, which is plan de quartier, local master plan, which somehow combined with the fact that technical instruments to transform the soils are much more invasive at this period, correspond to a totally different technical and cultural considerations for soil, okay? In this urban structure, soil is very important too. It somehow acquires a landscape status that is extremely important, also for sanitary reasons. Don't forget that now in our situation. Okay, these new morphologies were related to a sanitary discourse, but it was also relying somehow on the ornamental and landscape and sanitary value of soil, but much less considering its productive value as, for example, food production. So, paradoxically enough, we have soils that are for example, this is an example in Lausanne campus, okay? So this is the library of the Lausanne University campus, and I was looking at the soil in front of it. A very nice mid-wall landscape looking at the lake, but if we look at the depths of this soil, it's actually really damaged. If you can see, the first layer is, let's say, fertile soil that has been added over a very deep layer of construction waste, in which you can see concrete blocks, wood, metal pieces, every type of waste, very compacted. So it's a soil that has been super impacted, even if it looks at as somehow a very nice mid-wall on top of it. So two very different considerations for soil. But we can also find this is a soil, it's on forest that has been replanted on what is one of the major infrastructural nodes at the scale of Switzerland, okay? Next to Lausanne, if you take the train between Geneva and Zurich, you pass by this place. And if you drive from Geneva to Zurich, you also pass by this place. So very, very impacted in terms of infrastructures. But surprisingly enough, you have a very nice soils that is probably very young, 40 years maximum, due to earth deposit, on which a forest, urban forest, regrow. And this soil is actually quite in good conditions, not too much impacted, very dynamic, very alive, due to the forest that is covering it. Okay. I will go very quickly because there's not so much time remaining. I'm talking far too much. I try to compare these different soils, okay? Usually when soil scientists compare the soil, they compare it according to a chronosequence or a toposequence, okay? They look at the logic of the topography, which is determined by water and the gravity of water. This is the section that Danny Allen was drawing on the blackboard I showed you before. Or they look at the time as somehow the older the soil is, the more it is developed, etc. Actually, when we look at urban soil, this chronosequence or toposequence doesn't work very well. Why? Because you see it's a very complex process of saturation of this urban mesh, and it doesn't follow any topological linear logic. So if you try to usually soil scientists describe the main influence in terms of center periphery gradients with this notion of urban sprawl, okay? City is expanding on itself. It doesn't really work when we look at the reality of this territory. And to explain it, you have to use a much more complex sequence that I called an anthropo sequence that is both in time and space, and that is based on this historical trajectory I was commenting before. So this somehow this anthropo sequence is trying to reconstruct the ideal life of a soil from natural soil to agricultural soil, then soil that is transformed by cut and fill and landscaped, and maybe then it tends to renaturation and, for example, this urban forest I showed you before. Okay, so if you compare it in terms of a time gradient or spatial transect, as you can see, it's fluctuating. You don't understand very much anything. The idea of comparing this soil, is to understand the degree of resilience. Okay, how a soil after human influence is able to come back to a kind of normal functioning state. So it's fluctuating. If you look at the anthropo sequence, then some logic appears. I will not comment the logic in depth, but somehow there is three main patterns that reflects this impact of urbanization on soil. The first pattern I told you is the fact that urbanization creates urban sediments. Okay, it moves the earth. And regarding this, it's actually quite comparable to the action of glacier, for example, that also move, lithic material and so on. And then what I observed is that somehow after this influence of urbanization as a glacier or as a river that moved the soil is somehow regenerating faster and slower, but in a quite normal and natural way somehow. The second pattern is due to cultivation practices and how it transforms the cycles of organic matter and nutrients on the soil. And on this, actually, the observation is that urbanization and the influence of man do interfere on the natural cycles and somehow impoverish the soil. The good news is that the easiest influence correspond to, and you know that, I'm sure, to intensive agriculture, okay? And we can notice that the soils that are landscaped and used, for example, as meadows and parks in the city have a better resilience. And the highest resilience correspond, of course, to the urban wilderness and to this urban forest I showed you before. Okay, so these two different influence. There is a third one. I will not comment in depth because it requires a lot of comments. This notion that actually, surprisingly enough, pollution has a strong adherence to geomorphology. So man is transforming the geomorphology, the native landscape, but sometimes it has to cope with it, and it's still also influenced by the native geomorphology. Oof. Last part of the presentation. I won't have much time to go in depth. So I will select a little bit my comments. I will develop a comment on this. What's the situation now regarding soil management and territorial development in Switzerland? In the recent years, there was somehow a necessary paradox that has been constructed, but I need to comment further on this paradox because it tends now to close on itself, and it's really necessary to reopen it. So basically, since somehow the 1980s, the society started to acknowledge that soils perform functions that are necessary for us. So, to acknowledge the fact that we are consuming far too fast the soil resource. So it was decided, it was discussed at the Swiss level and also at the European level to protect first agricultural land that was equated to functional soils, and so protect the agricultural land and reorient urban growth toward existing urban areas according to this notion of inward urbanization. In German, it's Innenentwicklung, okay? So urbanization has to be reoriented toward existing areas, and urban soils has to be cast somehow as a priority for urban development. But then we realized that if soils have functions, and we have to recognize this function, well, urban soils also have these functions. And we also need soils in the city because, especially in face of climate change, etc., there is a crucial need also for ecosystem services in the city. So now we are like, okay, we protected rural land, what do we do in the city? And as you can see, the law that was implemented in 2014, Swiss Spatial Planning Act, which is a very important cornerstone in the history of Swiss urban development, tends to be difficultly implemented at the local scale when it comes to densification, okay? Also because this paradox is closed on itself, as long as we consider soils as a fixed capital that is non-renewable, and we equate urbanization to soil destruction. If this is the paradigm, then the only variable is demographic, okay? And as you know, control of demography always comes with sufferance. This is the urban growth scenario for Switzerland. Very, very important document that has been commented by many people, including urban planners, okay? I will comment quickly on this very important text by ecologist and geographer Claude Raffestin, who was teaching in Geneva around the 80s, at the beginning of this debate of what do we do with our soils in Switzerland. And the guy says, this notion of soil as a fixed capital is an error. We have to consider soil in a relational, as a relational object and in relation with our eco-bio-social logics. Okay, so the soil as an object of relations, and he speaks of soil as a time pocket. If we have soil, we buy time, and it also refers to soils as an anti-hazard system. Okay, and he says that we have to play not only of the capital of soils, but also, for example, on two variables. I mentioned demography, but also urban morphology and density, for example. I would add another variable, the fact that humans are also able to produce new soils, or at least to regenerate soils. And this is a very important variable that somehow open up this paradox. Okay. Another very important text by urbanist Bernardo Secchi, also in the 80s. Also, Bernardo Secchi was also teaching at Geneva around the 80s, so he might have somehow I've met Claude Raffestin. And in the 80s, the debate was, what is the contemporary city? What is this postmodern city, and how can we understand it? And Bernardo Secchi's statement is to say, if you want to understand the contemporary city, you have to shift the attention from the built volume to what he called lo spazio tra le cose, the space in between the things, the soil, basically. And this is by understanding the soil that we can try to re-understand the city. Okay. Maybe that will be, you tell me when I have to stop, because I want to keep time for the exercise. I will still at least comment this image. So this is the contemporary city of West Lausanne, what I choose to call the Swiss city, the Swiss Plateau city territory, in reference to André Corbeau's, who also suggests to describe the Swiss territory as a city territory. Corbeau is referring to Manfredo Tafuri, who coined the term città territorio, city territory. So let's look at it as a city territory, in a vision that doesn't oppose the soil on one side and the city on the other side, but consider that these two realities somehow are superimposed and co-evolve, okay? During my inquiries, I interviewed a guy who is an architect in West Lausanne and who runs a family company. His father was actually architect and developer, and he contributed to to most of the West Lausanne developments, these residential housings I showed you before. So he's a kind of witness of what happened in the 20th century. And I asked to this guy, in people's mind at the time, when they were implementing this very mix between agriculture, industry, housings, and now activities on this territory, what was the vision of soil they had? What was the representation of this territory for them? And he gave me this very interesting answer. He mentioned this notion of terrain de réserve. In English, it would be reserved land. Okay? This notion that this open land that remains in this gradually densifying urban mesh, city territory, mixed-use territory, is equated as a reserve that at the time was mostly an economic reserve. You know, this piece of land was your bank. Now, every family knows this story, at least in this region. You have this piece of land, one day there will be a supermarket in it and we all be rich. Okay, this notion of land as an economic reserve. What if we consider also this specific characteristic of the city territory, which is defined by a large quantity of very diversified soils, as also an environmental reserve? And if we consider soil with the capacity of providing both ecosystem and urban services. Okay. I'm not commenting this, and maybe, do I have still time to comment a little bit, or?
I think perhaps if you take another 5 minutes, we are fine. Okay,
let's do it in 5 minutes. So I produced these two maps, not only of West Lausanne, but at the broader perspective of the agglomeration of Lausanne-Morges, trying to oppose two representations of the same reality. This one and this one. In the first one, the red is equated to the building zone, in which open soils are regarded as building opportunity. The yellow one is the non-building zone within the agglomeration, somehow the garden. And the green is the rural countryside that is now protected and associated to fertile soils. Okay, this is a kind of caricature of what could be inward urbanization. Okay, let's try to propose an alternative vision of the same notion of inward urbanization. In this map, so first, there is not the agglomeration and the rurality. I try to rediscover this smaller mesh of smaller entities that correspond to interesting local synergies. The red corresponds not to the building zone, but to the actual building surface. The yellow corresponds to the open soils in the building zone. And the green is what is not the building zone, okay? And you discover a granularity of soil that is really different and that open up for synergies and functionalities at a very closer scale. Okay. I try to look at the different zones of the ongoing land use and look for opportunities and challenges. As you can see, if you look at the different zones, so it's zoning, the functional zoning, residential, etc. You can measure with the map I did different proportions of asphalt, different proportion of the garden, different proportion of the building zone, and there are opportunities to deseal in some places or to question what are these gardens meant to become. Okay, this is also in terms of soil trajectories. There is an opportunity to regenerate and reactivate all these soils that have been sealed and built up, and also to improve our gardening, private and public gardening maintenance practices. Okay, I will finish with three somehow projective patterns that somehow answer to the or echoes the patterns I presented before. One is related to urbanization as a process of soil sedimentation. The second one is concerning urbanization as a gardening process. And the third one is addressing the fact that this urbanization still has to cope with the pre-existing landscape. So, and the idea is we can understand inner urbanization not only as a process of densification, but as a process of regeneration of both the city territory and its soils. With this idea that we can understand urbanization as a process of anthropogenesis, as opposed to urbanization as a process of soil degradation only. Okay, so the first figure is all these platforms, industrial and residential platform that has been implemented, and also infrastructure that has been implemented during the course of the 20th century. And the opportunity to reprocess these platforms with the idea that we will continue to increase the amount and surface of urban sediments. We will also continue to increase the built surface, but maybe we can imagine to do that with a decrease in seed surface, okay? So this implies somehow a kind of reinvention of urban morphologies that is now somehow already happening, of course. I mean, I'm sure in your school, but also in architectural practice, now this is a topic that's completely ongoing. And let's document it from the soil point of view. So this is still this anthropo sequence that corresponds to an ideal life of a soil. So what's the future of it? We will have to create new soils, mostly by desieving, and these new soils will have to be dominated by construction material, because we will have all these materials, and now we cannot afford to create new soil from grabbing a soil from the rural area to place it in the city. So we will have to create new soil from construction and recycled materials. Okay. The second pattern is this mesh of open soil that characterize the city territory. In black, this is all the open soils. In color, this is all the undeveloped plots that still remain embedded in this urban fabric. And what's the future of this land cover category I called garden, which is made of brownfields, of vegetable gardens, former cropland, etc., etc. Also landscaped around buildings, etc. The idea is that the agriculture itself, as an intensive activity subsidized by the state, is still going to decrease in the city territory. The surface of garden is still going to increase, but it has to be diversified, and we have to re-acknowledge that it can be vineyards, it can be a forest, it can be a meadow, etc., etc. And so we have to improve the soil maintenance practices we have of urban soil. This is already happening in the public sectors. You know that now the soils of campuses, for example, are much better maintained. It's also true for the municipality, etc. It's questionable whether private soil maintenance and private gardens, for example, are starting to evolve or not. So what could be the new soils, the new gardens that would be more resilient? And this is also pretty much based on recycling of nutrients and organic matter and water. And the very last pattern would be this adherence or not of the city to the existing topography. In Lausanne, you can see that the sunken relief, so the the relief that has been created by the glacier is the one in which rivers have been buried, polluting activity has been concentrated, so ecological networks have been interrupted. Okay, this soil in particular will have to be designed in order to slowly recover this functional capacity as of soil, as for example, this capacity to filter and contain contaminants, to absorb water in the sunken relief, and also to be a support of biodiversity from the outskirts of the city, within the city, etc. Voilà, I will finish in here. And thank you very much for your patience. I used a lot of your time.
It's really great to see this work, which is I kind of think really bursting with ideas, and I can see that you will have a. It's fascinating. I mean, this kind of mapping effort and the effort, I think, which is really important to actually inform soil science from the perspective of urban design and architecture, right? And say, actually, we can do something to regenerate these soils and to begin to work with them. I was fascinated with this map that you started with these blank spots, you know, and saying, okay, these are not the concern of soil science, right? And I think to illustrate this vision of, as you mentioned, let's say several kind of agendas or guidelines, you know, for architectural practice. You mentioned them very clearly. For instance, increasing built surface but decreasing sealed surface. No, this is very interesting. But from the perspective of soils, perhaps it's not the same as the compact city idea, right? Or the compact city model. Or when you say that we should be understanding urbanization as a gardening process, this is also a very kind of inspiring thought that could mean different things. So I'm kind of eager to see your work go into urban design and architectural scale, where you really can illustrate all this, you know, as literally urban design and architectonic projects, so that people or that architects can learn about the potentials that are opening up for design, right? And perhaps we would, since we are a little bit tight on time, I would ask for precisely one question at this moment. Let's give it to one of our students who raised their hands first. Okay, great. So the question goes to Metaxia. Fantastic.
So, Antoine, thanks a lot. I mean, I really love your take, and I think it's really fruitful at the moment in the whole discussions we have about urbanization and rethinking our grounds. My question goes a little bit beyond your lecture. It's more a question of ideology of soil. So I wanted to ask you if you have observed in Switzerland ideas or other ideologies that are projected on the soil. And maybe I can explain the reason that I'm asking that, because coming from Greece and working at the moment in the Greek countryside, the soil and the underground, it's very much linked to archaeology or to ideas about life under the earth. So that even makes a little bit more complex the effort of redefining the soil and connecting it to broader urban or agricultural systems. So I'm wondering if for Switzerland, there is a specific idea or ideology or another kind of meaning which is projected in the soil beyond the urban or rural identity.
Yes, actually you are referring to the only slide I didn't comment in my, my presentation. I choose not to comment it not because it's not interesting, on the contrary, because it requires such a huge discussion that it's difficult to address it very quickly. But indeed, this is now somehow, I started with that, and now at the end of my research, I have to come back to this. It's not completely digested, but I will try to share. Indeed, the soil question is now, and this paradox that is built, okay, with this notion of let's protect the countryside and densify the city on itself, and then realizing that it's not working like that because we need soil in the city and the paradox is closing on itself, is actually a moment of somehow reorientation of the Swiss project. Okay, it's difficult to summarize it very quickly, but there is a kind of tradition or lines of thoughts in Switzerland that are considering this territory as, if I quote Rousseau, for example, a big city, or decided that the whole territory should be at the same time inhabited, the whole territory, and cultivated and productive, okay? With a vision that was, it's an interpretation, non-divisive, specifically non-divisive, non-dividing city and soil or countryside and soil, but really trying to superimpose both. And now the kind of saturation we are reaching in terms of soil stock triggered a kind of a radical evolution away from this notion and this notion of urban densification and protection of the rural landscape. And somehow this vision I had on soil and this re-understanding of the construction of this territory of West Lausanne as a city territory and not as urban sprawl was trying to fight against this devising or polarizing vision that is now rising more and more, okay? So the reading I try to propose actually, this comes from a beautiful professor I met in the US who suggests me that I should consider urbanization as a glaciation process, okay? Urbanization now can be compared and is comparable in terms of magnitude and in terms of impact on soil as the glaciations, okay? So it's, I think if we really try not to divide urbanization and soils and try to understand how this is a co-evolution, we can raise new imaginaries, such as the understanding urbanization as a glaciation process, or on the other way, trying to understand urbanization as a gardening process, as opposed to that can be diversified into urban wilderness, into many new urban texture actually that could derive from this. So this is a little bit this necessary reinterpretation of this long-lasting tradition in Switzerland to consider the territory as fully inhabited. That is now, I mean, at the core of the soil debate, let's say.
Great, thank you. So let's now jump straight into the exercise.
Okay. So the idea was so I wrote an exercise, probably your professors will forward it to you, a kind of...
Actually, not yet. It will be forwarded after your introduction.
Okay, so you will see it's very technical, very somehow cold, the way I write the exercise. So I tried to make it for you as a little experiment in a much more sensitive, quick, and rapid way, using only one device, which is my mobile phone. So I did a little experiment. I was walking by, as you can notice, this is very next to what I am now, which is my office, the neighborhood of Vidikron, and I pick up quite randomly, apparently, some open soil in the city that is on these pictures represented by these trees, and trying to understand a little bit what's this. So I pick up this place. I was struck by the fact that the urban grid of this district was suddenly interrupted by this kind of wall of vegetation. Okay, what's this actually? What's this topography? Is it already Uetliberg? No, it's not. Uetliberg is more far away. So what is it? It's probably a moraine, I thought. And it's also characterized by older buildings than the rest of the area. So first step, pick up a place. Then I would like you to try to relate this place to somehow, I would say, the topological, very basic knowledge you have of the city as a citizen and also as an architect. And actually, I realized that I was struck by this place because I already take a photography of this. This is the photography on the left. And why was I interested by this place? It is because it's actually the exact copy of my beloved park of Valency in Lausanne. That is the photography on the right, where I did this little experiments, okay? And in both cases, I started to try to imagine. So I said before, maybe this open soil in the city correspond to a moraine. I looked on the map, always with my mobile phone. You know that you can add topography to the Google Map layer clicking on these icons. And actually, I was wrong. The water is behind me. When I take the photo, I look at this little green thing in the city. The water is behind me, but the moraine is always between the river and the lake. So the moraine is there. You know, it's the moraine that goes down to Talville. This topography that goes along the lake down to Talville. And this little wall of vegetation in the city correspond actually to the erosion of the slope of the Uetliberg by the Zil River. So totally different geomorphological feature. So this is a first interpretation. You can relate, then you can double check with the topographic map and with many other maps that you can still access with this. I use the application Swiss map, which is the Swiss topo, but I'm sure there is one specifically dedicated to Zurich. And it's also interesting then to have different layers of interpretation of why this soil is as it is in the city now. I look at the urban process of development. So this alludes to the different layers I explained you in my expose. As you can see, I was struck by the fact that there was this topography and older, more fancy buildings than the rest. And indeed, as you can see, this topography was urbanized before the rest of the Vidicon neighborhood. Why? Because before the city, there was some vineyards in this place. And vineyards are the first urbanized places because they have good sun orientation, they have dry soils, and so that this is the most comfortable places to start to build the city. So you can do such kind of reasonings and correlate it to your experience of the city. For example, I live on the other side of the city, on the Zurichberg, but this is the same story here. When I woke up from my place where I live to my office this morning, I first woke in Sonnegsteg, then I took Weinbergstraße, then I took Obstgartenstraße, then Wasserwerkstraße. Okay, this is a chronotopo sequence of soil that really correspond, that intertwined geomorphology, urban history, etc. So let's try to, using all these different devices and picking up a place quite randomly in the city, try to understand the story and the situation regarding the soil in the city. And maybe the last step of this exercise would be to either keep the same place, or, for example, the place I took, there is not so much projective challenges on it. It's a park, a nice park in the city. It's crystallized as that, and it's not going to be changed a lot. The only change will be in terms of soil maintenance practices. But if we look at morphology and urban development, that's not a super site. But I confronted to another same topographic situation, another this kind of corniche, you see. This time it's on the side of the Zurichberg. And what if? What's the future of this? What's the value of this soil? What can it become in the future? For example, in my picture, the what if corresponds to what if there is a big sanitary crisis that locked down the city somehow, and this little remaining open space in the city acquires suddenly, immediately, in 1 or 2 weeks, a huge value, which is not only environmental, but also social value, and it becomes, this was somehow nothing. This was probably a soil reserve in terms of someone is going to build something in here someday and become very rich. What if suddenly it has another value, as it can obviously be noticed in this series of picture, for example. So this will be the last step of the exercise, you can do, trying to reformulate a little bit the kind of reasoning I presented to you during this lecture.
Great, thank you very much. And so let's discuss a couple of minutes the exercise. Any questions? Any comments? I have one particular question immediately regarding the format. So for kind of various reasons, and because we have a lot of students, we need to keep this as a one sheet of A3 per student, no?
So exactly. Do you see my screen at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
So indeed, exactly in the same way as you did for the exercise of Alexandra, we ask you to use an A3 paper, landscape format, so horizontal. You are free to compose these 4 steps that Antoine prescribed for you. The only thing we ask you is again to have on the top, in this case, it's my ... soil. So you can characterize my common Zurich soil or so on, your name and the date at the bottom right. It would be nice. I saw in some examples that you sent that you really followed the template of Alexandra this time. So here, maybe working a little bit more with photography in this case, or screenshots, as Antoine already demonstrated. You can structure this page according to your concept and idea of the exercise. Yes.
Would you like to turn on your cameras once again? Let's have a look at each other. Okay, great to see you. And yeah, because we are doing this really based on our somehow it involves a particular type of kind of imagination, let's say Zoom lecturing. So another 1 minute for a roundup. Any questions, any comments at this point? So
an additional note to Metaxias, you will have again 2 weeks to hand in the exercise.
So I think Antoine is asking you. Okay, we have a comment from Nicolas Roll. Would you like to tell us about it in the chat, from the chat? Nicolas, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Still tired, but yeah, I can do it. For me, it is very important that we regain the connection to our surrounding territory and therefore take the responsibility for the soil and biosystems we live in and upon, by maintaining, cultivating, and caretaking the land around us, which we constantly transform to our needs.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe just to sum up from my side, where I think it's very important that we don't see the things which are surround us for granted, so that we have to do something for the soil which is around us. We have to gardening, for example, to just taking the qualities of the soil. Otherwise, it will just dry out, and we will live in deserts sometime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's a wonderful comment. So I think what is interesting, or perhaps what I can perhaps imagine happening, there are, here almost, there will be, 160 students submitting this exercise, right? Imagine you live, or most of you live in the, let's say, canton of Zurich or even city of Zurich at this moment. So imagine we will have like a incredible map. Perhaps we should in the end collect your sites as locations, around the city of Zurich. And I think it is interesting how you can reflect on those sites with the ideas you got from Antoine, right? That our life, as you said, everyday practices can become a kind of process of gardening or caretaking. We can return something to the soils, we can cultivate them, we can bring organic matter, we can compost. I mean, this is in the, we can organize a kind of common practices around urban commons. We can take care in terms of how we build. We can perhaps unseal surfaces, some of you will be close to construction sites. Maybe you can redesign or reimagine projects, you know, around, let's say, areas that will have the perspectives of urban soils. So I think we could conceive this as a more projective exercise on urban soils, you know, where we will then have a kind of incredible, wonderful common, let's say, book of sketches and ideas around soils in Zurich, and almost a kind of a territorial project by the let's say, virtue of this let's say, dialogue among your various interventions that will be spread around the city of Zurich. So I think this can be very, very exciting, and let us keep in the communication, and certainly Metaxia will help you, and maybe even Antoine in the break of the writing of his thesis.
No more break.
Better not. I don't mean you should be answering any emails, but if there is a kind of burning question that maybe Metaxia could address to you or something like that, it should be limited maybe to one question, you know, because Antoine really has to submit on time. So we are even a little bit over time. And thank you for your attention, and thank you, Antoine, for being with us and for doing this kind of a brave, I would say, effort. I think it's fantastic. It's very, very inspiring, the work, and you know, go for it, pull it, you know, go for your PhD. It's a really important work. And thanks for being with us. Thank you also. Thanks everybody in the auditorium. Great to see you today. And we will have, of course, a break during the seminar week. And then we will come back on October 29th in our session 6 with actually a soil scientist from one of the leading experts and the ETH professor from the Department of Ecosystem Sciences, DEUSIS at the ETH, who will be talking about soils in relation to the urban-rural nexus. So we will have let's say, I have asked him personally to try to make a link to the practice and the interest of architects and urban designers. So perhaps even Antoine will find a moment to join us for this session. So we will have basically a kind of a converging two views upon the same topic. And I think this will be an exciting kind of interdisciplinary moment of kind of convergence that we are looking into. So highly recommend it. Enjoy the seminar week, and we look forward to see you next time.
Bye-bye.
All the best. Ciao, ciao. Thanks, Antoine. Thanks once again.